Today I want to share with you everything I think you should know before you make your first corset. While they might seem like an incredibly daunting project to take on, I don't think they're as hard as they seem. But some of them are more difficult than others. So first, I want to give you a rundown of some of the types of corsets. Also, all of this is my opinion, so it's a little biased. But coming in at the hardest kinds of corsets to make are bodysuit corsets, corsets with cups, and stays. This is my Mona bodysuit, and it is not only a bodysuit, but it also has cups. Cups are hard because as soon as you put a cup into anything, you enter the realm of bra making. And in the realm of bra making, there's a lot of complicated tension mechanics that serve to keep the cup from falling away from the body. And on this one in particular, I totally failed. These fall away from my body entirely, and this bodysuit actually needs straps where it really shouldn't. The bodysuit part, though, that turned out okay. Now, a bodysuit by nature is going to be a little harder because you have a lot more measurements to worry about. And as soon as you start factoring in your butt to a garment that needs to sit perfectly on your waist, you're gonna run into fit problems way faster. Stays, I don't even have any stays, but stays aren't even really corset. They predate the corset, and there's a couple different kinds of stays. Stays are difficult in that they just take a lot more work. There's way more boning channels in stays, and there's a whole lot of complicated binding that you have to do basically entirely by hand. So that is why I have them ranked pretty high. Now in terms of modern corsets, there are overbusts and underbusts. The difference being that one goes over your bust and one goes under your bust. But you can see this one is one without cups. Its construction is not a whole lot different than the underbust. On an overbust without cups, the panels are just going all the way up over your bust. But because you do have to worry about the measurements of your bust, I would say they're a little more complicated than an underbust, which I think is the perfect fit for your first corset. With an underbust, you have less measurements to worry about, you have less fabric to worry about, but you can still get a mighty fine snatched waist. And that's what I'm gonna show you how to make today. But first, before we start making our corset, we gotta talk about layers. So corsets can be anything from several layers to a single layer. Now, this is not one I made. This is an Orchard corset, but it is a 1-layer mesh corset. So what they did is each of these panels stop here where the boning channels are, and then they were sewn together, and then the seam allowance is hidden within those boning channels, right? And that's how you get a 1-layer corset, is you sew all your panels together and you cover up your seam allowance with your boning channels. And that way you only have 1 layer, but it's still nice and strong. But most of the time you're probably not going to make a 1-layer corset. You're probably going to be making something more like this. This is a 2-layer corset with internal boning channels, meaning that the boning channels are encased inside the corset. So the inside is a non-structural floating lining. Floating means that, look, I can kind of pull them apart in the middle because the lining is actually only attached at the top and bottom where the binding is, and at the backs where the laces are. But for this corset, the structural layer is the outside, and the boning channels are sewn internally, but to the outside layer. So you can see where the boning channels are attached from the outside, but you can't see the channel itself. Put a pin in boning channels though, we'll get to that later. This one is a monster. I don't even remember how many layers this is. I think 3. I don't entirely remember anymore. I made this last year. So this one has this cording, right? These couple pieces are flatlined pieces to allow for the cording to happen. And then they have a floating cotton lining so that it was nice and comfortable. I won't explain a whole lot of this corset because it's a little advanced for what we're talking about here, but just know that the layers of your corset really just depends on what you're trying to do. And they can be anywhere from 1 to way too many. But as long as it has bones, binding on the top and bottom, doesn't stretch, and laces up the back, it's a corset. So back to those boning channels. I would say the most technically challenging aspect of making a corset is getting really nice straight stitching lines on your boning channels. But that shouldn't discourage you from doing it, because like we just saw, you can put the boning channels on the inside of the corset where no one will ever see them. So today, we're making a 2-layer underbust corset with internal boning channels that are on the lining so that you'd never see them. I'm gonna start in a second, I swear. But first, we're gonna make a pattern. Nobody's body is the same, so even if you do get a commercial pattern, you're still gonna have to alter it to make it fit your body really well, unless you're just lucky. And if you are here for waist reduction, I have not seen a commercial pattern that really does that well. To have waist reduction in a comfortable way, you have to have that pattern custom fit to your body. Well, we're doing the old duct tape pattern again. Where'd the tape go? I just opened new tape. Oh, but as always, cover yourself in plastic wrap and then cover yourself in duct tape. And I always start out by marking the smallest point of my waist because that position is crucial to the corset fitting right and having your waist be snatched. For the seams, I'm going for a total of 5 panels for each side, and I want 3 panels in the front and 2 in the back, but if you have like a curvier back, you may want more panels in the back. And these don't have to be perfect because we are gonna clean this up on paper. We only need 1/2 because it's symmetrical. For now, I'm going to escape the clutches of my tape corset, and we're gonna put it on paper. And at that point, you can either add seam allowance by hand. You can use a little compass thing to add seam allowance. You could take a ruler and do it that way. I'm actually going to digitize this because it is the easiest way for me personally to get really accurate seam allowances. But the way I do that is I'm going to mark these on paper like I normally would. I'm not even going to cut them out. I'm actually just going to take a picture of them with my phone while they're on the grid of my mat. And then what I do is I take that photo and I put it into Illustrator, and I can use my mat as a guide to know how big an inch is, which also tells me how big to scale the image. So I scale it based on the scale of 1 inch in Illustrator, and that way I have the full correct scale of each of these pieces. And any edits I do are also to scale. This is all stuff you can do by hand. This is all stuff you can just do on the paper, but I like to have it digital because I'm kind of messy, and kind of the only way I can get a really clean, really nice looking pattern is to have it digitally. It also means I can keep it forever, even if I lose a piece. With the pattern made, we can make our mock-up. Now, if you make a pattern yourself, you basically need to make a mock-up because you have no idea if that pattern will work. Okay, so I've done my mock-up. Truth be told, I did 2 mock-ups to get it fitting right. You can see how much the pattern got altered, especially here at the side seams, especially on the waist. And you can also see how much curve I left in for my rib cage. Another thing though about corset mock-ups is it is a very good idea to make yourself some reusable lacing strips. You can make some yourself, but I actually just took these lacing strips off of an old, like, cheap Amazon corset that I was never gonna wear again because I already harvested all the bones out of it. And now I can just use this and baste it into my mock-ups so that I don't actually have to install grommets into my mock-ups because that saves a lot of time. Another thing you can do, I didn't actually bone the mock-up, but you do kind of want to do that. I'm pretty confident that I know that this fits, but especially if you're doing a longer line corset, you're going to want to put some bones in there, but you don't actually have to sew boning channels into the mock-up. You can just take some duct tape and tape them in, and that totally works. One more thing I do want to mention about the fitting is if you can hold it up to your body and it goes all the way around or almost all the way around, it is too big. Now, that might depend on your body. It also might depend on how much waist reduction you actually want. But for me, that rings very true that if it goes all the way around or close to it, it's too big for me and it's not going to do the things I want it to do. At that point, it's just a really, really boned bodice. It's not really giving you any support or any waist reduction. So now that we have our final pattern and we know that it fits because we did a mock-up, we can move on to the real one. So for this, I have already cut my pieces out because that shit's boring to watch. For the lining, I am using some black coutil. Coutil is a really special kind of fabric because it has a very tight herringbone weave. Regular fabric is woven like crisscross, but the herringbone weave is much more tightly woven than a regular crisscross weave. And so that means it is one of the most non-stretch fabrics you can get, which makes it perfect for corsets because you want something that's not gonna stretch out. Also, random fact, that also makes it really good for masks because it's tighter, so it filters out more stuff. Anyway, for the outside, I am using red micro suede. I love micro suede. If you didn't catch the fabric video, I've put micro suede on probably every cosplay I've made in the last 5 years. It is also particularly nice for corset making because reality is I don't even really need the coutil for the structure. I could kind of just double up on the micro suede and that would be thick enough because micro suede is also pretty dang non-stretch. Anyway, at this point in your corset making process, you could really go in 2 different directions. The first way would be to flatline your pieces. So if you were doing that, you would take your lining pieces and your outer fabric and you would pair them all up together with their corresponding pieces and you would flatline every single one of these pieces together. You would then just make it the same way you would do a 1-layer corset where you put them together, you press them open, and you would cover all of your seam allowances with your boning channels, or you'd leave your seam allowances on the inside. I'm pretty sure historically they did that, but that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the second path, which is I'm going to sew the lining wholly together and the outside wholly together. Okay, so the lining / structural layer is all together. It looks like this. And like I said before, if I hold this up to my body, you can see it looks like it's not gonna fit, but we know it is gonna fit. So now we're moving on to the very important, very crucial step of pressing all of the seam allowance flat. Do not skip this. Please do it. If you happen to have a pressing ham or a tailor's ham, they are very helpful for some of these really curvy spots. But if you don't have them, that's okay. Just be careful not to press any creases into your corset. But once all of these are flat, we get to add the boning channels, which is the most tedious part, but also kind of the most crucial. Well, I lied. Before I put in the boning channels, I actually need to install the waist tape first. And you might be like, what the fuck is a waist tape? A waist tape is just a strip of a very tightly weaved fabric. So this is grosgrain ribbon. Grosgrain ribbon is incredibly strong and does not stretch, which makes it really good for waist tapes. The purpose of it is to ensure that the waist of the corset never stretches out. They're not necessarily necessary, but I certainly like them. I certainly think they contribute to the snatchedness of a corset, but there are a couple ways to install them. I'm going to be doing an invisible waist tape, and that just means you won't see it from the front or even in the inside. And the way you do an invisible waist tape is actually really cool, and I love it so much. So what you do is you're actually sewing it into the seam allowance before you sew the boning channels in. So when we put it in the seam allowance, we're actually just going to baste it in, and then it really gets sewn down when the boning channels go in. But it's a really cool technique. The way I do it is, first you'll see I have marked out my waistline, which I just got by the marks I have on my pattern. You start from one side, you just line it up, and then you hold it to that seam allowance and fold it over, and I'm just gonna put a pin in it. And then you can take all the rest of it, flip all that away, and you can baste it right there, right into the seam allowance. Now the first one is easy, and I'll show you how you do the next ones, but I'm gonna baste that in really quickly. Why are you going backwards? So to do the next one after, I take the waist tape. You might have to shift it up a little bit. You wanna hold it really tight, line it up again, hold it to that seam allowance, pin it in, and flip everything away so you can sew it in there. And then you just repeat that all the way across. And that is an invisible waist tape. So now we get to do the boning channels. I actually decided to go with twill tape because I realized I want to do single bones on this corset. Now, you can do single bones or double bones. It's really up to you. I tend to only do double bones if I'm really trying to support something. So if I have a corset that's going to be supporting wings or a big heavy skirt, I will double bone it. But this is really only serving as a fashion element, so I'm doing single bones. Bones in general serve 2 purposes. The first obviously being support, but the other thing it's doing, the thing about corsets is the laces in the back are gonna create a lot of horizontal tension. And when you take fabric and you pull it horizontally, it's gonna wanna fold over and pucker. And what the bones do is they serve to counteract that horizontal tension. Where you place the bones is also up to you. Generally, what a lot of people do is just put them where the seams are. But if you need more, you can add more. So, in terms of what you can use for boning, you have a couple options. The first and the strongest kind of bone is flat steel boning. Now, you can buy flat steel boning pre-cut or on a roll. If you buy it pre-cut, you'll get these nice already finished tips. If you buy it on a roll, you do need to finish the tips in some way because this is pointy metal and it will rip right through your fabric. The second kind is spiral steel. Generally, modern corsets have a combination of flat and spiral steel boning. Spiral steel is different in that it still gives you structure, but it lets you bend where you need to bend. So especially for the bones going right at your sides, you want more flexibility so that you can actually move. Then we get into the realm of plastic boning. Now, the big popular thing is the German plastic boning or synthetic whalebone. This is actually what I'm going to use on this corset. And the reason why this stuff is so popular right now is because it's wonderful. It's basically as much flexibility as you get with spiral steel, but it's a little bit stronger than spiral steel. It's obviously not as strong as flat steel, so you still do need flat steel for your really strong bones, but it works perfectly for every other place in the corset, and it makes for a very comfortable corset because its other property, and the reason why it's called synthetic whalebone is because it is made to emulate what whalebone used to do in corsets, which was like heat shape to the body. And this does that, which makes for a really comfortable, well-fitting corset. And then you do have another option in plastic boning, and that is the industrial cable ties. These big fat boys. They're not quite as strong, surprisingly, as the synthetic whalebone, and they don't really shape to your body quite as well. But they will work if it is all you can get a hold of. These will be fine if you use these in combination with flat steel in the back. You'll make a fine corset. What I do not want you to use, and what will not work well for a corset, is the featherweight boning that you can buy on a roll at Joann's. That stuff just isn't strong enough for a corset, and it's really made just for bodices. So keep that in the bodices, and if you want something you can go to the store and buy, I recommend these over anything else. I buy the synthetic whalebone from Brumley and Towbridge. I think that's how you say it. Sometimes they're out of stock, so you gotta be watching it. But I did just see that corsetmakingsupplies.com has this now, so that's really cool. These pre-cut bones I also got on corsetmakingsupplies.com. It's a really great resource for buying anything for a corset, really, but especially if you want pre-cut bones, they have a whole variety of measurements you can get for pre-cut boning. Anyway, for the boning channels themselves, we're doing twill tape. Sewing in a boning channel is very simple, but it is the most tedious part of making a corset. And again, if you're a beginner, you want to do these on the inside of the corset because if you don't feel confident sewing a straight line, if they're on the outside of the corset and you have a wobbly line, you might not end up happy with your corset, whereas you'll probably end up happy with your corset if you have wobbly lines on the inside that no one ever sees. But it's pretty self-explanatory. You're gonna line them up right on your seam and then sew down either side of that twill tape really close to the edge. And then aside from the ones that go on the seams, you are going to want one right at the back. You can see I have this marked out. So this line here is marking my 1/4 inch seam allowance for when it gets bag lined onto the outer fabric. This is a mark for a boning channel. This one is special. It is the only one that's not getting the twill tape, and this one is going to get sewn in directly with the bone already inside of it. Then this blank space here is where my grommets are gonna go. And finally, this line is indicating where I'm gonna put another strip of twill tape for another bone, because you always want a bone on either side of your grommets because that helps support them. So I'm gonna sew these all in. There's 8 boning channels going in, so that means 16 individual top stitches of a pretty precise nature, which is what makes this the most tedious part, is it just takes a hot minute. But when we're done, not only will we have boning channels, our waist tape will be completely secured inside. So all the boning channels are in, and I have already inserted most of the bones. The other great thing about the synthetic whalebone is that you don't really have to put any tips on it because it's plastic and it's not going to rip through the corset. So you can kind of just cut it and then it can go right in. But the flat steel boning will rip right through your corset if you just put it right in there. So you do need to put a tip on it of some kind. There's a couple things you can do. You can buy the kind of plasti dip that comes in like a jar and you can tip them like that. I don't like having that stuff in my apartment because it's poison. They also make little tips that you can buy for bone. You can also find those on corsetmakingsupplies.com. By the way, I hope this doesn't sound sponsored. That's just the website most people buy their corset from. The name kind of implies why. But what I do and what a lot of people do is just put tape on them. You can use duct tape if you want. I just have masking tape. I'm just doing the old top goes around, seal that with another piece, boop, and that should be good enough to not rip through your corset. But you're gonna put a bone in all of these twill tape channels, but your final 2 bones are going to be formed when we put on the outside. I have actually already made my outside because it is, of course, the same pattern as the lining, so it went together the same way. Mine, of course, has an extra little bit of detail on the front, and if you are also doing the Strawberry X Miku cosplay, all I did was top stitch in these 4 strips of bias tape and basted on these scallops to the very front panel before that got sewn into the rest of the panels. And then to hold them down, I have by hand gone through the back and sewed those scallops down to this layer by going through just that bottom layer of the scallops, and that will keep them down. So that's that. So now the next step is to bag line these, but you don't bag line them all the way across everywhere. You actually only bag line them at the very back seams. So you're gonna put them right sides together, line up your back seams, and do a straight stitch along both of the back seams. Then you flip them right side out, and those are the finished edges of the back of the corset. This is also the part where you make sure you didn't forget anything before you do this. And I don't think I did, but I'm gonna go ahead and do it. If you got a keen eye, you would have noticed I forgot to press the red layer. Whoops. I'm still gonna press it. I'm just awkwardly pressing it while holding the black out of the way. We're gonna be fine, but I did forget something. Of course. Why didn't you warn me? So here she is. Yes, the red is pressed on the inside. Here is proof. So now for the last 2 bones, I'm gonna go ahead and put an adjustable zipper foot on my machine. You can use just a regular zipper foot, but I like the adjustable one because it's really, really flat on one side, so you can get really close to that bone and not have to worry about breaking a needle. So now I'm gonna take my bone, I'm gonna put it right up against that edge. Oh, I gotta replace the thread because there's still white thread in the machine. Hold on. Not good. Too aggressive, too aggressive. Was stuck in the zipper foot. Do I have a red bobbin? Ooh, I do. So I'm gonna take my bone and I'm gonna put it right up against this edge. I'm gonna put it in the machine. I'll really push that bone right into that. Line it up. I'm gonna bring the wheel down so that I know it's not hitting the bone. And that zipper foot should keep the needle away from the bone and keep everything straight, but do be careful. You can very easily break a needle doing this. And now you should have a boning channel, the perfect little size for your last bone. So now that those are in, the next thing we gotta do is flatline these 2 layers together on the top and the bottom, which is obviously really simple. You just do it with a straight stitch, but I do recommend lining up all of your seams. Please make sure that you cut your bones small enough so that you can actually get that stitch in there, because you'll probably break a needle if you hit one of the bones. All right, now we finally get to my favorite step and the last step before the grommets. The binding. What we bind a corset with is bias tape. You can just buy pre-made bias tape if you want to. I went ahead and made some bias tape so it all matches. But the reason why you bind a corset is because you can't really bag line it, right? You can only really bag line it at the backs. Because of the bones, you're not going to be able to flip it all the way inside out. So we bind it with bias tape on the top and the bottom. But you just install it the same way you do any bias tape, and if you don't know how to do that, all you do, take all your stupid little clips off of it. All you do is unfold it, pin it right sides together with the edge of the fabric, sew that edge on, and then flip and fold it over, and then you actually have a couple options to finish the back side of it. The hardest is the stitch in the ditch, which is where you do a stitch in the ditch. That's a really precise technique. It does come out beautifully, but it can be a little hard to do on corsets because you do have to look out for the bones. And the easiest way, and what I'm probably going to do, is just finishing it in the back with a whip stitch by hand. But once that's on, we go to the last step, the grommets. Okay, so the binding is all on, and I have already cut all of my little holes for my grommets. I actually just use this leather hole punch thingy. You're supposed to use an awl, but that doesn't really work for microswade, so I like this thing. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do the laces at the back. There are lots of different kinds of grommets you can buy. There's lots of different sizes, and if you've never done this before, you want to make sure you're buying a kit that has a setter with it. They're very easy to understand. Essentially, there's a little base thing. You put the grommet on the little base thing, and then there's a little tool that you insert into the grommet, and then you hit it with a hammer, and it sets the grommet. I actually have a thing that does that automatically. This big guy, my grommet setter. It works exactly the same way as those kits, except I don't have to use a hammer. So you can see there's a little surface down here for where you put the bottom of the grommet. There's a thing up here that sets it, and with this, you just go boop. You kind of have free reign on what size you want for your grommets, though the smaller they are, the more tension you'll have. I have done corsets with really, really big grommets before. It makes it a lot easier to lace quickly, so I would say it's personal preference. But generally, when you do a corset, you do want relatively small ones like these. I actually bought this big guy because I live in an apartment, and if you don't have like a really stable table to set the grommets on, they won't set right. You need like a really solid surface to do it. So what I used to do is I used to go outside and I used to do it on the concrete, but I can't do that now. So I got this thing, but this thing is absolutely worth having. It makes the tedious step of doing grommets so much easier. So if you plan on doing a lot of corsets, or you just like adding lacing strips to your cosplays in general, I do highly recommend investing in one of these things. They're really nice to have. But with the grommets in, the corset is finished and we get to try it on. Now, I do gotta warn ya, if you choose to go down the route of making a corset without a busk, you then have to deal with the fact that every time you put it on, you have to lace it. But it's not that hard. I just do it from the front and then spin it around, and that works for me. Now, something you also need to be careful with when you make corsets, when you wear corsets, is you are supposed to season them, which essentially just means to wear them in a little bit. So you don't want to lace them all the way up the first time you do it, or you risk sort of stretching the fabric more than it should be stretched. Another thing to note is that you'll notice when I lace around the middle, I'm skipping 2 grommets and going out of one and in down to the other. This is called the bunny ear method of lacing, and it is the easiest and best way to do it if you're going to lace yourself into a corset, because it allows you to tighten it yourself. Okay, so normally with the bunny ear method, what you do is you actually tie a bow down at the ends here, but because this corset doesn't have a busk and because I need to get out of it, what I do instead is I take my ends and I safety pin them. That way I can take out the safety pin, get the laces out a lot faster than if I tied a bow. Now, I can spin her around, haha, and I can take my bunny loops and you grab the bottoms of them and pull upward to get the slack out of the bottom, like that. And then you can grab your X's and pull them up, and you take the top of that loop and you pull down to do the top. And then you just take your bunny ears and you tie those in a bow, and that's the corset. Plenty of room to breathe because I left all that nice room for my rib cage, and my waist reduced pretty good. Now, this could close probably a little bit further, but remember, I don't want to do that right now because I gotta let this thing season. I'm really happy with the fit, and with a corset, that's kind of the big deal, is the entire point of making something. A corset is so that it fits your body really perfectly. Now, this piece of my cosplay specifically didn't really need to be a corset, but I think corsets are just incredible garments that show off a variety of skills. You have to do so many things to them to get them to look good, and in my opinion, they're not that hard to make. Thanks so much for watching. I hoped you liked the video, and if you did, you should hit the like button for me, because it tells the YouTube robot that it should show other people the video, and this is a pretty small channel, so we need all the robot help we can get. Also, don't forget to subscribe, because I am currently working on the giant project that is Strawberry X Miku, so more stuff on her is coming soon. And if this does encourage you to make your first corset, please come join the Discord. We have a wonderful little community of very supportive and helpful makers who just want to see other people succeed. And a big thank you to my big support tier patrons, Pins, Snip, Claire, and Samina. New one, Samina. Thank you, Samina. If you also want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon. But have a nice day. Good luck. Bye. Also, you may have noticed there is an addition to the desk behind me, and it's kind of a bittersweet addition. This is my grandmother's Faf. She passed away last month, and she was an incredible sewist, an incredible musician, singer, but most of all, she was an incredible grandma. And I've sort of inherited her machine, and I want to give it the same level of care and respect that she did. She apparently took it to get serviced every 6 months. So I'm still doing a lot of research on how to use this machine properly, how to maintain it correctly. So you will still be seeing the brother quite a lot, but very soon you'll start to see some of the very cool things that this machine can do. Anyway, I thought I'd mention, since it's behind me.